All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We'd like to welcome you to the second in our Connect Ahead Community Mindshare session. These sessions are really an opportunity for the Ahead community to kind of come together with our peers, our prospects, our partners in the spirit of fostering learning and knowledge sharing. With the prevalence of work from home across most of the IT industry in the last couple of weeks, we believe that these sessions offer a great opportunity for the overall IT community to come together and to engage on various technical topics. So thanks all for joining today. We hope to see you at our next session. My name is Damon Gross. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect with Ahead. I've got 20 plus years in IT in general, the last 7 of which I've been focused on the security space. Joining me today also is Eric Gardner. Eric, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Eric Gardner. I'm a senior engineer at Ahead, specializing in data protection. I've got about 20 years in IT, most of those as a customer, dealing with backups and disaster recovery in some aspect or another, and the last 2 years as a pre-sales engineer designing those solutions. So, great to be here.
Awesome. So today's topic is going to be focused on ransomware preparedness and its relation to data protection. With the continual evolution and maturation of the ransomware threat landscape, a lot of our businesses that we're working with are reevaluating their data protection strategies to ensure, that their critical data is safe from malicious access and tampering. The most common questions we hear from our clients are, how do I ensure that I'm adequately protecting my critical data, and how do I evaluate my current policies against those best practices? So, in our session today, we're going to be breaking down that ransomware landscape and how it's evolved, what that new threat landscape looks like, what organizations can do to ensure that their data protection policies are aligned to best deal with these new threats. It really won't be a product pitch or specific to any one type of technology, but rather we're going to be focusing on kind of the overall threats that are out there and the capabilities that companies and teams need to leverage and the technologies that they need to leverage, to most successfully combat those threats. At the end of the session, we're also going to have an opportunity for an open QA session. So please utilize the chat function here in WebEx to submit any questions that come up during the presentation, and we'll get those addressed at the end. So with that, we kind of wanted to just start with a high-level kind of review of the ransomware landscape and how that's evolved over time. And really the best way to kind of think about it, I know a lot of companies put up, the scare slide, right? And that's certainly not our purpose or goal here, but really, there are some trends that we are seeing in the market specific to ransomware. The biggest one is it's like $1 billion industry, right? I mean, this is really matured in the last couple of years to be, probably the #1 threat. And there you can see the very first kind of statistic backs that up, right? It is the most common, malware variety that we're seeing in the field today. The compound annual growth rate for ransomware infections is just kind of skyrocketing from 2017 to 2019. Holistically, we've seen a 97%, increase in that type of attack specifically. And what's most interesting is that, it is affecting a lot of customers or companies that are doing the right things in security, right? For instance, 77% of them have been running, up-to-date endpoint protection. The other thing that we're seeing is a shift to, less opportunistic type of infections, but very much more of a strategic or targeted attack. A lot of times we're seeing an increase in dwell time. The average dwell time now is over 100 days, right? So, where ransomware previously was, try to land and encrypt and get ransom as quickly as possible. We're seeing that mindset shift a bit, in the latest attacks where the dwell time is long enough where they're really doing a good job with lateral movement and scoping out and scanning a company's infrastructure to make sure that when they do hit execute on their automated attack, it's as effective and as crippling as possible. Because of that long dwell time, we've also seen that the ability for our customers or for companies in general to detect those cyber attacks quickly has really been impacted, right? 92% have self-reported that they're not really able to self-detect those things in the early stages of those campaigns and kind of do that prevention, minded approach. And for those that are impacted, we're also seeing an increase in the time it takes to recover from those attacks. So, what the conversation here is today, certainly if you think about, your typical cybersecurity, prevention versus detection, we're really talking about, what companies can do under the assumption that they're not going to be able to protect themselves 100% against ransomware threats. So where should we focus our attention? Where should that attention be, shifted to make sure that if we can't protect our organization against 100% of those, what are the other things that we can do to make sure that we're in the best position to recover? And so to understand that, it's also interesting to kind of understand the history of ransomware over time and how that's evolved, specifically focused on, what was our exposure as these ransomware campaigns has matured, and what has our response been as IT organizations to that various exposure. So it's interesting as you kind of read through the history of ransomware, just to know how long it's been around, right? The very first kind of proof of concept came out all the way back in 1989. If you think about, what we were doing in the 80s, for those of us that were even in IT in the 80s, we shared data typically via, floppy disks and things like that. So the ability to contain it or to recover from it was, fairly easy. But it is interesting to know that the roots of ransomware kind of do go back that far. The first real waves that we saw, which I kind of collectively call like the annoyance wave, really started around the 2005. And it was really focused on local data and local systems, extremely opportunistic, see if we can get somebody to, execute a malicious package. And it went after really local data. So as a security industry and, as IT teams working at companies, we really focused our efforts from a response capability on just making sure we have the latest antivirus, the latest, firewall definitions out there, put spam filters and things in place to try to stop those as much as possible, and really start training our users, what not to click on, right? The next wave is really where we started seeing some attention to ransomware kind of more holistically, not just people in IT talking about ransomware, but really, broad press coverage of a few, very popular or very high impact ransomware campaigns. And then, that kind of second wave, if you will, what we really saw was still they were targeting end user data or end user machines. And so our response as a, security posture was really, let's make sure that we have, more up-to-date antivirus capabilities. Let's work on maybe doing some, point or strategic backups where we need to. Let's do some manual recoveries. And, it's interesting, in that first and second wave, a lot of times those ransomware campaigns were leveraging static encryption keys, right? So once you could break that decrypt key, you could publicize that, right? And so, the FBI or other organizations were widely publicizing if you got hit by, a particular type of ransomware, here's a key that you can leverage to decrypt that data. So it was more just kind of bringing attention to the ransomware in that second wave. As that matured, right, it's always a cat and mouse game, right? So ransomware started becoming a little bit more serious in the third wave, around the 2016-ish timeframe, where we started people seeing, ransomware campaigns using, individually generated encryption keys per infection. And they started targeting things outside of just the end user data that were on the individual endpoints. We really started seeing in this kind of wave of ransomware, that they were starting to also trying to encrypt network data. If I'm on a laptop or something that got compromised, do I have any connections through a network share or a network drive? And can I start encrypting data leveraging that particular piece? We also saw that they started, being a little bit more invasive in the fact that they were, going after, your adjacent neighbors, right, in that space. So if I'm sitting in a call center or something and it infected my machine, they were using a little bit more worm capabilities to try to get around to the rest of those in a lateral movement perspective. So as a security industry, we started focusing on more EDR, right? So let's not just look at the antivirus, but also let's look at the processes that are running on those endpoints, the network communication, what files they're accessing and what volumes. And it started getting us a little bit closer to that. I can detect when these things are happening a little bit quicker, and I might have an opportunity to shut them down. But at the same time, we also saw that, ransomware infections continued to grow. So the other things that we did as security folks is started working on, is our network appropriately backed up? Can I start giving individual users the ability to recover their data through like volume snapshot services or shadow copies? And, worst case, I might have to actually start considering paying that ransomware to get my data back. And because, we were doing some of the right things, the ransomware folks that are putting these campaigns together started evolving and maturing as well. So this fourth wave that we're seeing over the last couple of years is really starting to get fairly critical, right? We're seeing not only are they, targeting your network data, but they're starting to target our backup data and the backup systems that data resides on directly. They're leveraging that 100 days of dwell time to make sure that they can appropriately map your entire infrastructure. And when they execute that automation, they're going to be a lot more effective in crippling your ability to restore, functional business services. And we're really almost seeing the rise of like ransomware as a service. The entire market has kind of matured to the point where it's actually pretty easy now to go out and get common exploits and chain those together in an automated framework. And leverage that 100-day dwell time to really target those backup data and systems. So as a security community, what we're seeing is people starting to move towards the concepts of like immutable backups, right? Once I write that data, it's not changeable after that. I also see a big increase in, rapid recovery being a big component of where companies are focusing their time. I don't need to be able to restore my data in 2 weeks. I need to be able to restore my data in like 2 hours. Because this could be business critical down type events. We're also seeing a maturity in people being and putting together things like incident management or incident playbooks specific to ransomware so that their security teams and their operations teams really have a good understanding of what are the steps I need to take to declare an emergency or identify an emergency, and then what do I need to do to very quickly start executing against our list of policies or procedures to start restoring functionality back into my environment. And then finally, we've also seen a big uptick in customers starting to leverage things like ransomware insurance or paying retainers to, cyber recovery firms where they can get boots on the ground or, immediate assistance to start dealing with those things. Specific to, ransomware increasingly targeting backups, they're doing it in a number of really creative and interesting ways. So Eric, why don't you kind of maybe just walk us through some of the things that we've seen lately?
Yeah, so like you were saying, the ransomware attackers have gotten smarter over the last few years, and frequently they're attacking or targeting the backup systems before they even launch their primary attack against the production environment. So they're trying to take down the backup environment first so the customer can't recover and is more incentivized to pay the ransom. And backup environments weren't designed for cyber protection. You've got typically a master server that hosts a catalog, the backup catalog on it. You've got your backup clients, and of course your media servers. And these are all susceptible to attack, especially when you're talking about backup catalogs. If those, sometimes it's as simple as wiping out a backup catalog, which then makes the rest of your backup data, even if it's intact, it's either not very useful or it's going to take a long time to recover without a good catalog in place. So, and these environments have been set to replicate. A lot of customers have prodded DR. They're replicating their backup environment. That replication's happening in real time or near real time. So if the production backup server gets wiped, those changes get replicated to the DR site, and that gets wiped or encrypted. Same thing with when we're talking about your backup target. So disk is susceptible to encryption just like any other file system, depending on how the backup application writes and what protocols are open on that disk target. And then even tape. So, tape can be a little bit more secure if it's off-site, but a lot of times tapes are in drives. They can get wiped just as easily as disk. And tapes are notoriously unreliable in the first place. So the more tapes you have, the more opportunity for a bad tape or unreadable tape if that's your last recovery option. So I think, Damon, you were going to talk about.
Yep, sorry, I was on mute there. So it's not just the head that's saying, these things, right? There are, government organizations that are coming out and starting to put out some pretty strongly worded, pieces out there to the public. For instance, just late last year, the FBI put out a high-impact cyber attack warning to organizations saying, it is critical with the rise of ransomware that you need to regularly back up and verify that data to make sure that you can get restored. It's also not, a good idea to just leave your backup system as it is, but let's start looking at the way that you've deployed your data protection systems to make sure that they are, not on the same network or not super easy to use in lateral movement, and kind of start isolating those systems away from your production systems. And if you are infected, even the FBI today is saying one of your best areas of recourse is a solid and mature data protection strategy. We've also seen third parties really start popping up and offering their opinions as well, right? So Sheltered Harbor is a somewhat new kind of organization. It's a nonprofit organization founded really around the financial institutions in the U.S. And it's really kind of a set of criteria that says, this is what good looks like to us. If you want to really most importantly back up your critical data, these are the capabilities that you need to have to do that. So they've put out some guidelines and some principles around what, a really strong data protection strategy and platform looks like. And just like what we saw with PCI, right, which when PCI first came out, it was kind of a voluntary thing. A bunch of the credit card industry just kind of came together and said, hey, these are things we think would be a good baseline of security that all of our customers should be doing. And then that became more widely adopted. I kind of feel, and this is just my personal opinion though, that things like Sheltered Harbor, even though it is specifically focused on the U.S. financial industry, the findings and the recommendations that they're putting out there have the potential to start becoming and kind of bleeding into other types of compliances or other best practice recommendations. So for those on the call that aren't, part of the financial sector industry, it's good to know, what other companies or what other third parties are saying as, to what good looks like, and to start skating to where that puck might eventually end up and get ahead of that a little bit. And finally, what we're seeing, holistically across kind of all of our customers that we're talking to is, that breakdown of silos. So similarly to like what we saw with DevOps a few years ago, right, where, we've identified some inefficiencies and a better way of doing things if we can bring those teams together. We're starting to see that with security as well, right? A lot of times the security team needs to get, for instance, better visibility into what's happening in that data protection environment. They might request things like, I need better logging or better just who's accessing those systems over what ports and what protocols, so I can get a better understanding of how we're protecting that data. Or they might say, hey, we have some new policies and suggestions that say that you need to start doing things, operations teams, with this data to make sure that it's fully, protected. And from the operations side, for those of you that are sitting more on that side than the security side, a lot of them we're hearing from customers, my security team is asking me to do these things with my backup protection systems, and I'm not sure how well to implement that, or they're asking for logs or audit logs or access logs from my systems, and I'm not really sure how to get them that data in a meaningful format so they can run their security analytics against it. And then finally, management. Obviously, as ransomware continues to get more and more, kind of news and publication around the world, CIOs, CISOs, boards are asking the management team to say, what is our strategy? Where are we now, and what do we need to do to improve upon that so that we aren't the next, customer X that just got, hit by ransomware and was taken down for 3 or 4 days and lost a bunch of revenue. So, the merging of kind of these different disparate organizational units within a customer or a company, we're starting to see alignment now as to what is our actual ransomware preparedness and what are we doing and what can we do better. So that's the goal of today, is to start, providing kind of a list of capabilities and kind of a roadmap of those capabilities that companies can use to leverage where they are now and what are the things that they should be doing to improve upon that maturity.
Okay, so let's talk about recovery. So your backup system is only as good as your ability to recover with it, and we're going to talk a little bit about how recovering from a cyber attack is different than your traditional prod or disaster event recovery. So first question is, can you recover from ransomware? These are some examples of companies that recently got hit with ransomware and were not able to recover. So Heritage Company attempted to recover. Their backups got encrypted. They tried, they realized they had no good backups to recover from at all. Their IP was lost and they had to close their doors. Pensacola and Baltimore, examples of some municipalities that did have backup systems in place and were more mature, but even still, if those backups get hit and taken down, it can take quite a while to recover from an attack, and you may not get some systems back up. Some of these systems were never recoverable in both instances, and Baltimore had to take some critical systems offline for a period of time in order to rebuild their environment. And then another interesting example was the creators of the ransomware inadvertently broke their own decryption tool. So there was a bit that got flipped somewhere in their coding process. Essentially, the tool that they created to decrypt their quote customers didn't work and would decrypt some of the files, but then other files would be missing bits at the end. So customers may get some decent data back, but a lot of that data, if they were able to recover it, was unusable. So even in this instance, ransomware attackers generally want to have good working tools because they want to make money off these attacks, but their programmers made a mistake and broke their tool, and their customers can't pay, and it's still floating out there in the wild. So it's another example of something to keep in mind when we're thinking about how to recover from this. So this is based on a study that ESG did. Again, this is a hot topic, and this is why Damon and I we've had quite a few discussions with customers about this. We're finding even in our talks that we're pretty much aligned with what ESG is seeing, in that a lot of customers are planning or testing or talking about testing in some sort of isolated recovery environment, because a lot of those customers have experienced downtime due to a cyber attack, even if it wasn't a full-blown cyber attack that infected the whole organization. I know myself as a customer 5 years ago got hit with CryptoWall, affected one of my remote servers. It was an email inadvertently clicked on by a user in a remote office. We were lucky we caught it early and were able to stop it. But if that had spread more rapidly or hit a different set of servers or a different data center, we would have been in more trouble. So we got a little bit lucky there, but we did experience a little bit of downtime while we were recovering from it. And also, we'll pass. So CISOs, I mean, their job is security. I'd say traditionally a CISO focused on security of production data and network, environment variables, user access, things like that. But they're thinking more and more about how to protect themselves against these particular types of attacks, and using their security budget to help create a plan to recover from it. So, and then again, backups affected. There's a lot of ways that backup environments can be targeted by this, and over half of those customers had some amount of backups affected by a ransomware attack. So we're talking about cost of ransomware, and this is something to keep in mind with ransomware insurance. Sometimes the easy or maybe potentially easy option is to say, well, we'll just get ransomware insurance, and if we get hit with an attack, it'll cover us. It's maybe cheaper than putting in some other solution, and we don't have to manage anything. Well, the cost of a ransom is just one factor when you're thinking of the real cost of ransomware. So I believe CodeWave was the organization that came out with this $84,000 average number, CodeWare, sorry. And this was in Q4 of 2019. And that $84,000 average ransom paid was a 100% increase from a year prior. So customers are paying ransom attacks. Even so, they found that only 97% of the customers that paid were able to recover data. And of that data that they recovered, I think something like 2 to 5% was not recoverable. So even paying the ransom doesn't guarantee you're going to get data back. But on top of that, you've got the time, the forensics, all the man hours spent recreating and recovering from one of these attacks. Even if you pay the bounty, there's tools that are required to decrypt your environment. So other costs besides the ransom itself. Okay, and risk profile. So thinking about how to protect yourself against a cyber event is a little bit different, similar in some ways, but different in other ways than planning for a typical backup and DR environment. So, any data that you have on your network is susceptible. Ransomware attackers not only are getting more sophisticated, but they're selling the tools that they create on the dark web. So less sophisticated attackers can get access to these tools, change, modify, and send those out too. So any data on your network that's accessible by a user is certainly susceptible to a cyber attack. What we're seeing is storage replication is in use in customer environments. This is, of course, prevalent, but the downside of that is if prod gets hit or DR gets hit, it's going to replicate to the other site, and now both sites are down. Same thing to keep in mind with backup catalogs. And, of course, people and processes. Any security person is going to tell you that people are typically the weakest link when trying to have a strong security environment in place. And same thing when we're talking about a backup environment. People access backup environments. You've got user credentials that need to get into backup systems, and these credentials can be taken or spoofed, and that's another avenue. Okay, and how is CR different than DR? So disaster recovery is designed for very quick recovery of natural or man-produced events. You've got a data center that's out due to power issues or a network issue. That's what a DR site's for. It's meant to have as up-to-date as possible a copy of your good data, and in a lot of cases, your backup data as well, for a quick recovery. Cyber recovery is a different animal. The cyber recovery is designed as really your copy of last resort of your critical data. So if you're using your isolated recovery vault or your cyber vault or whatever a particular vendor wants to call it, if you're accessing that, that means that you've got a prod and DR environment that's either down or under attack or is in an unknown state. Potentially it's still infected. Maybe you've caught something, but you don't know what servers or you don't know the breadth and scope of how many servers have been infected. So in some of those instances, you might be looking at going back to bare metal and recovering your critical IP, which is certainly the last resort, but better than having to close your doors permanently.
We've seen a lot of customers struggle with this, where they think they've got a really healthy DR, strategy in place, and then they get hit with ransomware and they realize DR is significantly different from cyber recovery. So when we look at, what we need to do from a security perspective, a security focus on, the way that we're starting to protect that data, or even how we're thinking about that, what we're seeing is a lot of people using, like, for instance, the NIST framework, which is something we use very heavily here at AHEAD, to say, can we identify, a particular attack? Can we protect against it, detect it, respond, and recover from it? And really, what we want to focus our talk track today on is in the protect space, to make sure that you've got good and solid, that bastion of last resort to get your data, and then can I leverage that to restore that data quickly and as painlessly as possible to get past that. So some strategic considerations, right? Things you need to start thinking about as companies in this space is, what is my most critical business data? Have I identified it? Have I gotten buy-in from the business that is what we need to make sure that, we do have that bastion of last hope against that data? When we see customers do that initially, they're simply targeting maybe 10 to 15% of that data. But if they start, socializing that across the broader business, they start realizing that that amount of data is oftentimes much larger than they initially anticipated. So really having a good understanding and working with the business and getting agreement and buy-in that this is our most critical data is huge. Then obviously evaluating what the total amount of that business data is and what we need to do. Do we have the capacities to, stand up a third copy someplace and start protecting it in a slightly different manner? Do we understand not only the data, but the business objectives of that data? What's our RTO and RPO for getting that data back in line? What's acceptable risk to the business? And then making sure that they've got full alignment across the entire company to make sure that everybody's aware, this is our policy, this is the data that we've selected, these are the metrics by which we're going to judge our capabilities against, and making sure they get buy-in across the entire organization. We also see companies occasionally missing certain things, right? So specifically, it's around critical rebuild items. There are some fairly devastating ransomware events that have happened fairly recently, by which entire infrastructure pieces are taken offline. And so oftentimes these are items that you might want to consider that might not be part of that initial critical rebuild item list. Things like, certificates or Active Directory configurations, DNS configurations, your event logs. We're seeing an increase in that as well. You might have a SIM or something else, and that is part of the spoliation of the ransomware. And so from a forensics or post-forensics cleanup process, do you have access to that data? Do you have your networking configurations, your storage configurations? Did you include your intellectual property or your host and rebuild tools? And then finally, did you include your documentation for what you need to do? Do you have your full CMDB or asset management extracts? Do you know what your DR, your cyber recovery runbooks and checklists are? Are those available? Your HR resources and contact lists, and your incident response plan. So making sure that those are part of that set of data that you're putting extra, focus on is really, really important as well. So again, back to the concept, we don't want to necessarily talk about individual technologies and the ways by which they can do that. We're going to really focus more on the capabilities that you need to have, right? There are lots of different vendors, and it's a very rapidly maturing space to address ransomware targets, but different companies do it in different ways. They might mean different things when they talk about immutability or the backup, targets that they can cover. Maybe where they're storing that third party, it might be on-prem with leveraging existing technologies. It might be something in the cloud with, some blob storage in one of the major, cloud providers. Again, we want to kind of get away from the nitty-gritty details and start talking about a little bit more of the higher level capabilities that you need to have, and also mapping those capabilities around a good, better, and best, right? So there are some capabilities that you can implement pretty painlessly and quickly that get you to at least a good level. And then you can continue to mature those capabilities to get to better and to best. So on the data protection best practices, right, what are the things you need to focus on? And the first one is, have you identified your data? Do you have a third copy of that data on disk or tape someplace that has different policies around it than your primary backup data? Do you have network segregation, separation of duties? Have you run a recovery drill? Are those backups immutable in some way? Do you have up-to-date code and firmware that has removed some potential vulnerabilities from your data protection infrastructure? And do you have any sort of access controls in place, or is it kind of the Wild West? A lot of our customers are, backups or data protection is definitely one of those, if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of a things. But maybe it's time to start reevaluating that. Am I running the latest code versions? Have I applied all the correct patches to address the security vulnerabilities? Better is really what we start calling hardening and advanced features, right? Maybe I can leverage the specific hardening guides for those vendors to make sure I've fully locked down that environment as best as possible. Am I leveraging things like encryption in flight and or at rest? Do I have things like retention lock with separate security officer credentials that, if I want to change any of the backup data that's in that third copy location, it's going to require an extra level of access, and I'm protecting my, spoliation kind of exposure because of that, even including things like two-person authentication. And then really best is that full air gap with immutable copies and some analytics against that data. When I'm writing data into that third copy location, can I start running some heuristics or some analytics against it to understand, was that data compromised, or does that represent a good backup step for me to restore my data, including things like network isolation, management isolation, separating your control planes, making sure that the backup data in the catalog is completely isolated and immutable, and again, providing those data analytics on top of it. So what we've done is kind of put together kind of a maturity framework for this, right? If you think about the way that you're protecting your data today, your prod or even your DR network, right? You've got your data protection data that's someplace with the metadata about it and some sort of, second copy location already deployed. And again, making sure that you've identified that full set of backup data, that you're fully covering it, and you've maybe even segmented that data into my bronze, silver, and gold tier, or business critical data versus non-business critical data. So you can start making your policies and your policy decisions in a more informed manner. Again, making sure that you're not running on older or vulnerable infrastructure. You've applied all the latest security patches to your environments. Making sure that you get some level of protection against lateral movement or lack of security controls, right? If everybody's got access to that primary set of data, those spoliation techniques are extremely easy to leverage. Encryption, even across the network, right? A lot of times if backup commands or other data is being sent into clear, it can allow an attacker to really very quickly identify your backup protocols and start, masking those things or spoliating them through those methods. And then when you think about where your, kind of cyber recovery backup storage, or that last bastion of your data is, there's also sometimes lack of access control there. So if that's a tape library, we've seen spoliation techniques where they literally just log into a web interface or can start executing commands against the tape library and manually executing tape moves into a cleaning head, right? That would be completely, invisible to any sort of backup software that's running on top of that. They assume that that tape is in a good state, but that tape has manually been moved into a cleaning unit, and suddenly, that when you go to restore, you realize that tape is now completely empty. Isolating those, that kind of backup storage from the rest of your network, logically or physically or something, is huge. Getting visibility into the network traffic that's occurring between those two, so you can start identifying odd access patterns, network patterns, ports, and protocols that have never been used, is also pretty important. And then finally, for those that do have that bastion of data and it is in a good state, even those that have done kind of all of the right things up until that point, if they haven't considered what is my restore process going to look like, is it a lot of manual steps I have to take? Is it going to be streaming data off of tape? Is that going to be really, really slow? If you haven't gone through that kind of exercise to really understand that, you're going to be in a pretty poor position to recover quickly. So the first things to focus on there is to make sure that you've got a well-defined, backup policy that's segregated into what your data needs to be so you can easily apply those policies on top of the data sets. Upgrading, again, if it's not broke, don't fix it is kind of the standard mantra in data protection, but really push yourselves to understand, is there a later version of code or hardware or firmware that's out there that would allow me to reduce my attack footprint on that particular piece of my infrastructure? Start getting visibility into your network or segregate your network in such a way that you can guarantee that the communication that's happening between my primary or secondary storage and into my third copy storage is well locked down, and I've got visibility into our other endpoints or users trying to and failing to access that data. It might give you a really good early indicator of compromise that something's going on. Make sure that those copies that are in your third-party storage are immutable, that users can't just go in and spoliate them, delete them, encrypt them, things like that. And to do that, the best way is typically putting some sort of RBAC control against that particular storage platform, again, whether it's in the cloud or if it's on-prem, and then run some recovery drills against that to make sure that you are able to successfully, get that data back out on some sort of a time frame.
So layer one, good start. However, still some concerns there. There's still opportunity for data to escape because that access controlled storage isn't as secure as it could be. When we're talking about tapes as a recovery option, the more data you have, the more tapes you've got, the more opportunity for a tape to be bad or missing or have a bad catalog item associated with it. And tapes are slow. So still some concerns, but it's a good start.
The next layer up, what we would kind of call better then is, once you've done those kind of, first level things and you've got your, infrastructure up to code, you've got better visibility, you've got RBAC controls in place, is to really start extending the rest of your security policy into your primary data protection infrastructure. There's a lot of customers that we go to that have really good security policies, or really good technologies and tools that they can leverage for their production workloads, but they don't always put those on the backup infrastructure themselves. So things like logging or even just some sort of, analytics against what's happening in your primary, data protection would be that first place, right? Let's start extending the security walls that we would extend against any production workload into our data protection, infrastructure as well. Let's also make sure that as to the best of our ability, we're leveraging encryption at every layer, right? Encryption across the wire into primary storage, encryption at rest, encryption across the wire into your third copy storage, and encryption at rest even in that third copy storage so that, you're lessening the ability for somebody to scan your network or kind of sit passively on your network and understand kind of what's going on, where those data protection platforms even are. When we start talking about better, one of the other things that we want to do is we want to ensure rapid restore, right? And for us, rapid restore really just means disk of some sort. Again, whether that's in the cloud, whether that's on-prem and blob storage or just standard storage, or there's a, dedicated kind of cyber recovery vault appliance that you have, the ability to make sure that that data is coming back quickly is really, really important. And then finally, let's also maybe focus, if it is a purpose-built appliance, if it's something in the cloud, that we've got good RBAC controls, dual-factor authentication, and we've hardened that infrastructure as much as possible.
So definitely a good improvement on the good vault, but analytics, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, there's no analytics there, so you can't validate that your data is good if you don't have a sandbox environment inside. Having a way to bring that data back, make sure that the data that you're trying to restore back into your prod environment is good and clean is certainly going to be something very important to validate. And then it's not really a true air gap. There's still communication going between the vaulted cyber environment and your prod or DR environment.
So finally, once you've done with those things, you can start layering on kind of that, best approach. And again, security through layered security is kind of something that we've all been very familiar with over the last while. And really, starting to get that true air gap concept in here, right, where those ports and protocols are very locked down. They're only allowed during certain times of the day. They have to be initiated from the direction that you would expect. There's really good visibility into if something's happening outside of that synchronization. That's really what starts defining a true air gap. The second thing is to start layering on some analytics capabilities. When I land that data in whatever my cyber recovery vault is that data good? Has there been something in the pattern of that data, the amount of that data, the frequency of that data that would indicate to me that potentially I've already been exposed to a cyber recovery, a ransomware event, right? So the quicker you can get that and the better you can understand, where can I start restoring good and clean data from? Analytics is what really starts giving us a lot of efficiencies with that. Also, having some sort of sandboxing capability, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about analytics, air gaps, and sandbox on the next couple slides, but having some sort of area where you can start restoring that data and really validating before you put it back in production that it's clean, it's not still infected, I'm not restoring encrypted data back there. And then finally, isolating as much as possible, in fact, almost completely, the management plane and the data plane in that, kind of cyber recovery vault is critical to make sure that, there is no ability for a bad actor to get in there and start doing any sort of spoliation, fool the analytics results, compromise that sandbox environment. And really, once you get all of those things pulled together, you're starting to meet the criteria of those like third-party, like sheltered harbor pieces, right? Now you are, really doing all of the things that you could do to best protect, validate that data, and make sure you're in the best position to recover. So we wanted to just provide a couple of quick high-level thoughts here on what really a true air gap means. A lot of times operational folks will say, well, yeah, it's air gapped, right? Because I've got, good firewall policies in there, and I've kind of got good visibility into that. But really, if you, talk to a lot of, security folks or risk folks or compliance folks, they will say, well, really, air gap means these things, right? So all of those communications into anything that you would consider your protected vault are only allowed over certain ports, only allowed over certain protocols, and only during certain times of the day. You've got good visibility and good processes to detect abnormal access or abnormal access requests on that. Otherwise, outside of those times of the day, it is completely physically or logically isolated, which includes even the management plane. And a lot of companies or technologies can now start leveraging automation to really reduce the kind of day two, footprint or run rate of what it's going to take to manage that environment. All those requests, if they can be, it's best to put them in a pull, right? The vault or the technology that's sitting in there as your last bastion of hope needs to request that data. That can't come from anywhere else. In fact, one of the best ways you can encourage that or even mandate that is through the use of like one-way data diodes. And then when we talk about a sandbox, the important thing there is, again, if you're in a cyber recovery, position where you need to start getting your data back, you need a staging area or like a clean room or a forensics lab to start putting that data and making sure before I put this back in production, is it really clean? Is it the data that I expect? So having some sort of compute or resources or storage resources available to do that is extremely helpful in making sure that that process is as quickly run as possible, and can also be used for like those recovery drills. I don't need to recover this maybe all the way to production, but I can put it into my sandbox, run analytics and differences against what's in production versus here, and make sure that everything is clean and well.
Okay, so having analytics software is a key piece of certainly the best option. You want to have a way to verify that the backups that exist in that cyber resiliency environment are actually good, clean backups you can recover from, and if they're not, having a way to either determine when a server got infected or a backup set may show infection, or at least helping to bring you some, pointing in the right direction as far as where you should start looking for cleaning. So if you don't have any analytics software, having backups in the vault is still good. However, this is what's really going to point you in the right direction as far as recovering quickly. So what are we talking about with analytic software? There's some other certain versions out there. There's SaaS options. There's on-prem analytic software. And in this instance, we're talking about analytics within the cyber resiliency environment. So, hopefully, if you've got a security team at your company, they're most likely they've got their own tools that they're using on your production environment, and that's great. We're not looking to replace any of that. This is solely for your backup environment. So what are we analyzing? You're analyzing your backup set, and you're looking at change over a period of time. These softwares can scan sometimes either the metadata or the actual data itself for certain or any backup sets that are coming in, and looking for things such as changes over time, and looking for files that got encrypted on a file server, or database tables that grew exponentially on the 10th backup. Things like that it can look for and flag and alert the backup and or security team as to a potential infection or problem, something for them to look at. So it gives you some intelligence on your backup data. It's another layer of security, and in the event that you have to go to your cyber vault and do a recovery, you've got a record of changes on those backup sets and those protected servers.
It also becomes another really strong integration point. So if you look through that analytic process, it's a very standard security analytic process. Scan whatever it is, run some analytics to find out what those outliers are, correlate those to kind of reduce that false alarm or false positives. And that's a great point where you can start leveraging maybe the logging features or the kind of data sharing features of that analytics platform directly with your security or your incident management team to give them that really rapid time to detection so that now we are being impacted. Maybe none of our other controls caught this, but we are now seeing an uptick in high change rates on a particular set of our data, and we need to start initiating our cyber recovery incident playbook.
Okay, and how can a head help? So I'm in the data protection practice. There's a lot of things we can do to help you as far as figuring out what backup sets should get protected, strategizing a good vault environment, taking a look at your current tools and products, and seeing helping you rationalize or potentially consolidate that. And then deployment services. We're certified to deploy just about everything out there.
On the flip side, we also have security consultancy, because this is really a merger of kind of data protection and also putting some security into it. All of the things that Eric just mentioned, from a strategic consulting or a tools rationalization and consolidation or a roadmap discussion, can also be around like analytics or tying this into your existing tool sets or your existing processes. What do those integrations look like? How can we better, integrate these tool sets that we already own? What does a good workflow look like? Or how do we better harden our existing environments, right? So it's not really just data protection or operational focus. We can also provide some really good opinions from a security focused perspective. So with just 5 minutes left, we've opened up the QA session, and I see that there's a couple of questions that have come in already. The first one is Vendor X is touting their solution as capable of addressing ransomware, but they don't have all the capabilities that were listed in your, kind of best section. Is this really marketing FUD, or do you know of companies using a particular vendor where it's been successfully leveraged to recover from ransomware? So I guess, the first one is, it's a fast-moving space, right, which is one of the other reasons we wanted to not really focus on how vendor X does it versus vendor Y, because they're adding capabilities to their products at a pretty rapid pace. It also really depends on the attack, right? So if you're looking against, a fairly just standard off-the-shelf ransomware attack, most of the vendors that are out there leveraging things like immutable copies is probably going to be good enough. But if you're getting hit with a particularly advanced piece of ransomware or malware or a campaign that's really leveraging a lot of different tool sets, they're really exploiting that full 100-day dwell time, then you're really probably going to need to start leveraging a lot of the capabilities that are in what we would consider best, the analytics, the immutable stuff, the air gap, to really best, segregate and isolate and protect that data. And so our recommendation is, as it's an evolving space, continue to just look at third-party recommendations or compliance frameworks like Sheltered Harbor to give you, better guidance. And even if it's not directly applicable, you could be a manufacturing firm, you could be a retail firm, but just, look towards those other ones and kind of skate to where the puck would be. And I guess the final part of that would be, there's many orgs that we've talked to that have had or experienced or tried to get through ransomware events. A lot of times, unfortunately, when it comes to security, there's a lot of NDAs in place, so we can't give very specific examples of how we've helped our customers, but a broad kind of blanket statement would be we've done a lot of work recently specific to this just because of the kind of attention that it's getting kind of worldwide.
Okay, and I see another question. I think we've got time for one more question. What are your proposals on the analytics softwares in the market? Good question. The analytics software you're looking at, we're talking about inside the cyber resiliency vault, is going to depend a lot on what backup product you're using currently. There are some products out there that will scan backups from multiple vendors. So Index Engines makes a product. Other vendors have their own specific tools for their particular platform. So I would say I believe our contact information is going to go out after this webinar. Hit up us or your AHEAD team, and we can definitely work on the best options for your current environment.
All right, just being mindful and respectful of everyone's time. There's a few other questions that are coming in. We are almost at the top of the hour here, so we will take these questions and make sure that we get back individual answers to those that have asked them. So thank you, everyone, for joining today. Hopefully you found the presentation to be useful. Look for another event. We're going to be doing another one of these. We're doing them bi-weekly, so not next Friday, but the Friday after. We'll have our next event being published very shortly. So thanks, everyone, for joining. Have a great holiday weekend for those that are celebrating it, and stay safe out there.